And he came up with 4 principles, which seem pretty sound, but remember, it's based on a very small sample size. This is for-profit businesses. This is not non-profits. These are all for-profits. But they seem kind of intuitively appealing, so we can at least start there. Basically, the first principle is that long-lived companies are sensitive to their environment. Now, this actually doesn't seem to apply very well to religious organizations or some of the other ones we've talked about that have a very core focus and want to stick with that focus and don't change. But for-profits, that kind of makes more sense. If you want to actually grow and be sustained, then you need to better be changeable. You have to be sensitive to shocks to the environment, changes coming up ahead. As in the example of the company that shifted from building temples to building coffins, you have to be flexible. So basically, these are companies that reacted to timely conditions, but only for-profit organizations. They also tend to be cohesive, according to Henri de Geus. These are companies with a very strong sense of identity. They know who they are. People working for them know who they are. They feel part of an organization. It's not just a job to them. They're excited by the mission of the organization. They're behind that mission. And we would hope that's something we can foster in cryonics organizations, especially if people working for them are members of the organization, which is, for instance, Alcor, all the core people are also members of the organization. All the directors are members of the organization. So that's a pretty important thing. It's not just a job to them. It's a personal matter. And so as you get larger, that becomes particularly important because you can't directly manage very large numbers of people in different countries. You need something else to hold everybody together, that common sense of purpose. And a part of that is, in these companies, you tend to find that managers, leaders of the organization, are chosen from within the company. Now, that's a big issue of controversy in the business world. Should we have a CEO from the ranks or hire a big name from outside? And there's back and forth about that, but it looks like if you're interested in long-term survival, generally having managers develop from within is a lot safer. Now, maybe a big outside manager, bring in Jack Welch from GE to take over your organization, maybe you'll do really well and make lots of profits in the next few years, but you may not do so well in the long term. And that, again, sort of intuitively makes sense. Thirdly, de Geus found that long-lived companies were tolerant. Now, by that, he really meant that they are quite happy with decentralization. They don't try to control everything from the center. Now, that obviously doesn't apply very much to small cryonics organizations, but as we get larger, perhaps we'd have branches in different countries, or we'd work with other organizations in other countries. You have to better take your hands off at a certain point and trust people to do things on their own. You don't want to be micromanaging everything. You don't want to be controlling things too much. And also, it also means that you have to be tolerant of some peculiarities. So maybe there are people doing some experiments in one of your divisions that you think, this seems kind of strange. I better shut that down. Well, maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you should let the experiment go forth. If it's a small experiment, if it's making a small bet, let them try it. Because you're going to learn a lot more by people making small experiments, small bets, and failing sometimes and succeeding other times. That's really the only way you're going to learn very well. Strange, odd individuals, eccentricities, outliers, you have to be able to manage those. You have to be able to let them do their thing. Obviously, you can't just let them do anything. You have to manage your risk, but that seems to be an important way of surviving long term. And again, that may apply more to for-profit organizations. Maybe, how much does that apply to cryonics organizations? That's a matter up for discussion. Now, critically also, long-lived companies were conservative in financing. We've seen lots of companies, we've seen very large companies go under because they were not conservative with their financing. Used huge amounts of leverage, large amounts of borrowing. And that always seems tempting, especially when borrowing is cheap, but borrowing doesn't tend to stay cheap, and that could be absolutely deadly. So pretty much all of these organizations didn't borrow. They tend to accumulate reserves, kept accumulating capital, and that's pretty handy because not only do you have a lot of buffering against shocks in the environment, but if you've got a big load of cash sitting there, then if you see an opportunity, maybe at a difficult time, you can take advantage of it when other people are panicking because they don't have any money. So it puts you in a very strong position. So I think that these are kind of very non-scientifically derived with a small sample size of 30 companies, only for-profit organizations, but they seem pretty plausible, so we should think about how we can apply those. Let me finish off with just talking about a few things that Alcor has done to try to survive long term. and then I'll throw open to questions or comments. Let's see, do I have a... Okay, so I've been running Alcor for almost 4 years now, and when I took over the job, my first response was sheer unadulterated horror that I was suddenly responsible for all these lives, that this organization had been around for 38 years at the time, 42 years now. I was now the person ultimately responsible, and I thought, oh, what if I screw things up? What if something bad happens? What if the organization collapses? I'm going to be the one responsible. So I better think really carefully about how have that not happen. How do we prevent against that? Fortunately, a lot of things have already been done to ensure that's the case. For instance, what happens if the building burns down? Well, the dewars will probably be okay. We've got our sprinkler systems. What about our records, all our patient records, all that stuff? We have these things called red books, which are where we gather all the information on our patients. Any medical history we had, pre-mortem in the traditional sense of mortem, records of what happens during the cryopreservation, and anything else that someone wants to give us. That's basically all the information available. Those are in paper volumes, and when I saw that, I said, okay, where are these kept? And I said, oh, don't worry, they're kept in fireproof vaults. I said, oh, that's good, that's good. It's not good enough. We're going to back this up online. We're going to scan all of this stuff. And my assistant looked at that and said, oh, God, all of it? All of it. So it took a number of months, actually, but we scanned all of that stuff in, and that's now backed up not only on our server, also on a backup drive and in the cloud. So we basically have multiple redundancy for those patient records. Another important thing is, for institutional longevity, is preservation of skills and knowledge. And that can be a real issue, especially when you're not paying people much money, which traditionally has been the case in cryonics organizations. It's getting better, but you want to preserve that knowledge. When someone leaves, how are you going to have someone else take over effectively? Well, for that reason, we spent quite a lot of time developing SOPs, standard operating procedures, and documenting as much as possible. For instance, we have Hugh Hickson, a biochemist who does a lot of stuff, has created a lot of the processes at Alcor, does perfusion, does a lot of different things, and he's been around since the mid-1980s. But what happens if something happens to Hugh? That was always a question that came up for me. What if something happens to Hugh? Well, okay, we've got to train someone to take over those responsibilities. So we trained Steve Graeber to take over the perfusion and made Hugh document things against his will. So we made a lot of progress on that. So pretty much everything is well documented now. That makes it easier for someone else to take over. It's not enough. You really need to have other people trained, which is again what we're doing in many of these areas of responsibility, so they can take over quickly and effectively. Another thing we have, and some people say this is a bad thing, I don't think it is. Alcor has a self-electing board, self-perpetuating board. Essentially, the directors vote on who the board will be, and so people can put themselves up as candidates, but they don't get voted on by a general membership. And some people think that's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing because if you look at most nonprofit organizations, that's the way they do things, and for a good reason. The directors are the custodians of the organization's mission, and they can evaluate people pretty well in terms of whether they'll protect that mission and further it. Whereas people who stand for election may just be ambitious, they may just want to have their name up there, they may want to have control, they may not be really that good at preserving the mission. So there's a lot of risk if you have turnover too much like that. There are downsides to it, but I think overall that seems to be better for the long term. Now, obviously, we talked about financial institutions, and a very crucial part of long-term survival is financial management. So one thing we do at Alcor, which is unique, we have a separate patient care trust fund. This was actually set up back in the 1990s. It's run by a separate board of directors. So basically, when you pay your cryopreservation fee, of the $200,000 from whole body, $115,000 of that goes into the patient care trust. $25,000 out of the $80,000 from neuropreservation goes to the patient care trust. I can't touch that money for anything. I can't use it for office expenses. I can't use it to fly to Germany and talk to people. I can't use it for anything fun like that. It can only be used for patient care. And the separate board makes sure that's the case. Along with that, there is the rule that we never touch the capital. And we never have, actually. In fact, I don't think we've even touched the earnings recently. We've had enough money going in that we haven't even touched the additional earnings. So the capital is always preserved and, in fact, builds up over time. The idea being that if we never draw more than inflation, then that money will just keep going up and up and up over the time. So not only can we guarantee that we can afford to keep people cryopreserved indefinitely, even if it should take 1,000 years, in principle, we'd never run out of money. In fact, we'd have more and more. But at some point, when it comes to the time that it might be possible to revive and repair people, we're going to have a big chunk of money to do that. If you don't have any left over, you have to have the heroic assumption that it'll be free. And it's nice to think that maybe everything will be free in the future, but we don't know that. We also use strict accounting rules. We follow the GAAP rules. So that's all done professionally. We have externally reviewed accounts, because in the long run, that seems like a good idea to prevent fraud or minimize fraud. Our finance director, Bonnie McGee, has no signing authority. We have a separate CFO, it's Mike Perry, who signs checks. Our finance person cannot sign checks. She has no signing authority, which is a good thing, because I have complete trust Bonnie, but someone else might come in and take over, say she was unavailable, got sick, something bad happened, someone could take over. If you have signing authority, that raises a lot of risk if you're the person in charge of the money. So we separate that out. I guess I'm running out of time, so I'm going to wrap that up. Basically, the other security measures, we have physical security measures, everything from cameras and motion detectors on the roof to a patient care area that has Kevlar steel and metal plates around it, bulletproof glass. None of that's completely proof against a crazy person coming in, waving a gun in your face. And so we're always looking for further ways to improve that, given our resources. One other thing I should mention, I think is very important, is we have on the payroll, not an employee, but we have on retainer a lobbyist who spends his time looking at the legal landscape and looking for legislation being proposed that could be a threat to our existence. And we have had that in the past. We've had a case where someone in Arizona started to put legislation forth that could have given us a problem, and we fought it and we've won. And it's very important to have an early warning system. Once that legislation's passed, you can have a hell of a time getting that reversed. If you can anticipate it, and you go talk to people and get friendly with them, which we have, we're very friendly with the local politicians in Arizona, you can probably head that off. So I think that's actually a very important part of security in the long term. Okay, well, I better wrap up there because I want to leave a little time for questions. One other thing I want to mention on the Patient Care Trust Board, the directors who manage the patient care funds, a further safeguard there is that I have to check exactly, I think it's 2 of those board members have to be individuals who have relatives who are cryopreserved. So they have a very personal stake in the long-term continuity of the Patient Care Trust Fund. So really, what can we learn from these long-lived organizations? It's tricky. There's no really great studies. It's not clear how relevant they are. We'd have to argue back and forth about which ones are the best models. But there's some interesting points here that we can learn from, and I think further research is needed. But really, my final message is really, if you're starting a new organization, think about this very carefully. Don't just think about the next year or the next 2 years. Think about the long term and how you should structure yourself most effectively. If you're already existing, then think about how you can change your structure or keep adding to it, adding safeguards that will establish long-term longevity. Because we really want to survive, that means our organizations need to survive. Thank you. Do we have a few minutes for questions?
Don't you think we're a little closer to a religion than a business, and therefore the longevity is probably better?
I don't think so. Religions tend to be very cohesive, for one thing. They tend to, except when they have schisms, which does happen, but they tend to be pretty cohesive and suppress disagreement. Cryonics organizations seem to be kind of the opposite of that. We have a lot of disagreement, a lot of arguments, a lot of internal battles, and maybe that's a phase that we'll grow out of at some point. But we're not really based on faith. We don't really have a higher authority.
Churches have a lot of dissension, too.
Yeah, but they have higher authorities that they have to bow to, people who are appointed by a higher authority, and you better shut up and listen to them, whereas I can't really claim that. I can't say, my word comes from above, you must do what I say. That's not going to pull any weight. So I think we can learn something from the values. They have certain values that establish a cohesion, and I think we can do that. We can focus on our core values and our mission. Maybe we can apply that, but more broadly, it's not so clear.
Thanks, Max. In the past in Europe, people have thought it would be safer and better for the sustainability of the cryonics movement to bring all the patients over to the US in order to have them at one central location that can be easily maintained, defended, fortified, or just looked after. Are you of that persuasion as well, or do you think that some kind of distribution makes the entire organization more robust?
I think the answer to that depends on the time frame we're talking about. I think right now it does make sense to centralize storage because we achieve economies of scale, and if we're trying to keep our costs down, that's going to be pretty critical. And we're only really beginning to see economies of scale at Alcor with 129 patients, just over 1,000 members. We're only beginning to see those, and we can see a lot more ahead. So I think right now it just makes sense to do that. Plus, I was discussing this issue with the guys in Australia who started Stasis Systems and the other organization whose name I forget that's kind of working with them. And they were pretty much in agreement that it made sense in the short term to do stabilization, transport to other organizations, and then storage elsewhere, either Alcor or CI. For one thing, if your organization is 2 years old, how reassured do you think your members are going to be that they're going to keep you stored for a century when they maybe have one part-time person there? So in the short term, I'd say centralization does make sense. In the long term, yeah, I think once those economies of scale are kind of tailoring off a little bit, there's obvious advantages to having local storage, especially in somewhere as far away as Australia. So that would make sense at that point. So I think it's sort of right now, centralized, a little bit later, let's think about local storage.
Thanks.
Also, of course, in France, it's actually illegal, as I understand it, to store patients, so there you don't really have a choice. You can do the procedures, but you can't store.
You mentioned the patient care trust, and you mentioned the patient care trust, and you also gave some history on long-lived organizations. Do you know of any model organizations which have that sort of backup layer? And how has the performance of that sort of construct been in the past? I mean, has this been tried before, and how has it worked?
I don't know of anything else comparable to that. And the patient care trust actually is still not necessarily in final form. We're actually talking to legal experts right now about the possibility of creating really a separate organization. It's called a supporting organization in the United States law. Basically, it's set up for the sole purpose of supporting another organization, which would be Alcor, but it's legally separate, so that even if Alcor was destroyed by the government or a lawsuit, they couldn't touch the money in the patient care trust fund. So we're looking at that, whether that legal structure would make sense or whether that would bring our current tax-exempt status into question with the IRS. But I don't know of anybody else who has that kind of safeguard right now. One thing I didn't mention, by the way, is we also have an endowment fund, which just about a month or so ago actually received approval from the IRS as a tax-exempt fund. So now we can start going out and talking to our wealthy members to raise money for the endowment, which, if you look at large academic institutions, can be a very useful thing to fund long-term planning, because we can't draw more than 2% from that fund. So it's not like I can go, someone gives us $1 million, I can't go, woohoo, $1 million. What it actually means is I have $20,000 a year more, which is a bit more modest, but it lets us plan for the very long term. We know that money will still be there in the indefinite future. And again, I don't know of another organization that has an endowment fund as such. Now, I know other organizations have their savings and investments, but I don't think they have anything like that structure that I'm aware of.
I don't really know the situation in the US very well, but if I look into German environment, there are many non-profit organizations that have been there for a century or more, especially in the area of soccer clubs, chess clubs, recreational shooting, but also medical societies and other academic societies there, which are not really funded by the university. Have you looked into any of those, what their special structures are?
Yeah, that's a good point. Like professional organizations I hadn't really looked at, but that's probably a pretty plausible one. I'm sure there's groups going back to the early Industrial Revolution or earlier, to the Middle Ages, are probably still around. And I haven't really looked at those, but yeah, I imagine there are quite a few of those. That's kind of an organization of organizations, so I'm not sure how much that would learn from us. We might learn something about governance and how they manage conflicting interests, so that's an area I would definitely like to look into further. Good point. Thanks. So let's thank Max again for that talk. Thank you. I'm here for the whole weekend, so if you want to grab hold of me and ask more questions, I'll be here.